to controversy that engulfed Alex Salmond a few months ago, that the SNP have found it difficult to work out how to deal with this, because in that context he was inclined to give the assurances that ordinary people want, but assurances which are actually not really available to him to make, not with the kind of iron certainty and predictability which people want. So I'm not sure if Yes Scotland doesn't need to try and find a way to leap out of this unionist framing of certainty and uncertainty and try and spread the uncertainty a little wider and don't get fenced in by this demand for guarantees.
Ivan?
Yeah, very interesting points. I'm more optimistic than Andrew. I might not be as optimistic by the end of this week, but let's see what happens. I think that the white paper has been built up to be a key point, and I think it is. I think it's going to be quite critical. My understanding, with not being party to anything, but my understanding is it's going to lay out the framework within which Scotland would operate in terms of the foundation of the state, if you like, but it's also going to, as a separate aspect to that, if you like, effectively lay out the SNP's 2016 manifesto, which will go into a lot more detail on specific policies that they would adopt across a range of subjects. So I think what that does at that point, and this is a theory, we'll see how the practice works out, but what that then does is turns that whole uncertainty thing back on the no campaign, because you start to put pressure on the UK parties to say, well, what are you going to do in 2015 or 2016 in the UK or the Scottish context? And what are your answers to some of these big questions about what the world looks like if we vote no, in terms of Devo Max, etc. So if everything plays out to that agenda, and I think that's the direction they're trying to go in, then the concept is you're able to flip that whole certainty debate on its head and then start to quiz the Better Together team about what their future looks like.
I think there's been quite a lot of comments suggesting things wouldn't go very well for Scotland. There's been vague promises of Devo Max stuff, but there's also been veiled and unveiled threats of less power, less money, Barnett redone. But I don't know, Juliet, how do you feel about the certainty-uncertainty discussion?
Well, as someone who hasn't decided how they're going to vote, I'm incredibly uncertain. And I think that's part of the problem, is there are no guarantees, but there never are in politics. I think what's more interesting to me is when you do go down to London, the level of, it's not even complacency, it's they're already working towards the 2015 general election without even really considering what might or might not happen in September 2014. So I think that level of, we'll tell you what we're going to do in the UK in 2015, but we're not prepared to tell you what will happen to Scotland in October 2014 is really interesting, and I think, again, betrays a certain amount of willful, I don't want to be too rude, the dismissal of the entire referendum debate, and the fact that the polls are always saying that no will win out. So how does that sit in with certainty and uncertainty? I think that's my problem, is that, London is basically, for all Alistair Carmichael will say he's warning against complacency, I think they're just sitting there thinking that, the world will just continue on as it does. And that's my biggest fear.
Yeah. Can I quote a little thing here? You can try and guess where it's from, but I'll put this into the context of the Scottish independence, although it wasn't written that way. But okay, here's the quote. One often has to aim at objectives which one can only very dimly see. At this moment, for instance, the world is at war and wants peace. Yet the world has no experience of peace, and never has had, unless the noble savage once existed. The world wants something which it is dimly aware could exist, but cannot accurately define. This Christmas Day, thousands of men will be bleeding to death in the Russian snows, or drowning in icy waters, or blowing one another to pieces on swampy islands of the Pacific. Homeless children will be scrabbling for food among the wreckage of cities. To make that kind of thing impossible is a good objective. But to say in detail what a peaceful world would be like is a different matter. Ooh. Okay, so...
so far in 100 years.
But that was George Orwell in the...
Yeah, I was going to say, it's your usual touchstone.
Actually, in the essay, Why Socialists Don't Believe in Fun. But I think that's an interesting quote in this context. If you change a word or two, you could talk about that. We have to aim at an objective which we can dimly see. What he's suggesting is that the current situation isn't great, and that's what we need to stop. Something needs to change. Something needs to break. Isn't that enough to be getting on with? I don't know. Andrew?
That's sort of the classic defense of utopian type thinking, isn't it? That utopias may not be achievable, but their existence as a spur, as an ideal, as a kind of golden city on the hill, that kind of idea, is something which you always are moving towards. You're always sort of trying to reach. I can see that has its appeal too. I mean, though being a dismal lawyer, I suppose, and also I suppose being given to sort of flights of idealism occasionally, though people might not notice very often. I kind of try and hold these two thoughts in tension, I suppose, and I think we can expect people in Scotland to engage in both kind of thoughts, actually, to some extent. I don't think we can totally write off the question of the practicalities, because people are concerned fundamentally with pretty basic, straightforward things, and some of them are questions which can be relatively easily cleared up. They are sort of unreasonable fears. But I do know what you mean, that I think it's important in the context of making all of these practical arguments. It can take on the veneer of sort of technocracy and functionality and sort of Britain as usual, but with a sort of tartan overcoat. And I don't think that's quite what we're looking for here. So I wouldn't want to write off the utopian ideals that Orwell described so nicely there as having no place in this debate at all. I think that would be entirely wrong.
I'm just trying to imagine if someone stood up at the Radical Independence Conference yesterday and said, right, what we're fighting for is the UK with a tartan overcoat. How would that speech have gone down? Julia, I know you said you're undecided. What would convince you?
Oh, if I knew that, then I'd be able to go out and find what would convince me and turn it around. I mean, I guess the thing that we're doing, because I work at the Electoral Reform Society, and the thing we're trying to do is say, well, regardless of the result of the independence referendum, recognising that we are not in a good place, what sort of reforms could you introduce, regardless of where powers lie, whether they lie at Westminster or they lie with the Scottish Parliament or Holyrood, or whether they lie at a local government level. And I think that's what I'm looking for. I'm looking for some sort of commitment from either side to reform regardless. So admitting that they might lose or not win or whatever, and then saying, well, this is what we'll do anyway. And I think for me, it's that sort of continual reluctance to even acknowledge that you might not win that really pisses me off, because I'm like, well, somebody's going to lose. That's the nature of it. That's what's going to happen. So what would you do in that eventuality? And I think that would provide a little bit more certainty, because it would be like, well, this is what we'll do in our ideal scenario, but faced with the fact that, it might not happen, this is what we'll do otherwise. And because there's not that rationality to it, I just get I don't trust anybody. I don't know.
Because there's not that rationality. Just before we started recording, we were talking about Yes Minister. You reminded me of that. Hacker got into trouble for not stalling enough. Humphrey suggested you could have talked about the nature of truth. To which he replied, they're not interested in the nature of truth. They're all MPs, which I thought was good. But we should maybe move on to our next topic, which is equal marriage, which the bill was passed this week.
Stage one, not the whole bill.
Sorry?
We're only at stage one.
Yeah, stage one of the bill was passed. Sorry, that's me told again. What do you think about this? Maybe I'll start again with Juliet. Do you think this is long overdue? I mean, I don't have too much to say on this topic, just because I think, about time, get on with it, has generally been my opinion. But there were people voting against in the Parliament. I
mean, I agree. Generally, I'm like, whatever. Everybody should have the right to be married. It's a horrible place to be, so on you go.
Yes, exactly. So that's my mother's line as well. Why shouldn't men and women who find their same-sex attractive be entitled to be as miserable as I am? That's right.
I mean, it's really interesting, the arguments that come up and the way Elaine Smith feels like she's being called a homophobe, which she probably is. But for me, it's all about equality and about overcoming horrible prejudices that have existed for centuries and bringing everything onto an equal footing. And I think as an underrepresented group, insofar as I'm a woman, I find that really interesting. And it always reminds me of the check your privilege thing. And a lot of people need to remember that they're playing the game on easy. Like being a straight white man basically means playing the game on easy. And if you throw in all those other extra elements, that's when it starts to get harder and harder. But I think it's interesting that they're using the phrase "it's time," because I think actually one of the difficulties is that lesbian, gay, bisexual and transgender rights have almost changed so quickly that it's really people that a lot of sort of the more conservative elements of society are finding it really quite hard to keep up. So, in the same way, in the way that it took sort of gender equality still hasn't been achieved, but the way that's been going on for centuries, it's a slow and sort of burdensome progress. And people so don't see the sort of small incremental changes, don't feel quite so threatening. And I think that's the speed of sort of reform in this area is probably partly where the reluctance to just embrace it comes from.
And Ivan, did you have any thoughts on this story?
I think the same as you, Michael. It's long overdue. It's so obvious that it's the right thing to do, and I think it's one of these things that you'll see your grandchildren in future years. Did you know that as late as 2014 there was an equal marriage in Scotland, and they'll think that was bizarre and unbelievable. So I mean, it's long overdue. We've just got to get on and get it done.
Andrew?
It was an interesting session. I mean, being an anorak and of such things, I did watch it, and there were lots of sort of testimonial speeches by various MSPs, which were all rather good and quite moving in some places, I thought, actually. I think Juliet puts her very finger on the most interesting point about this, though, the speed. Remember, until the 1980s, until 1980, I think 1980 precisely, in fact, it was illegal to engage in homosexual acts, as the Scots law described it. Scotland, under the influence of the Labour Party and the religious bodies of the country, didn't follow England in '67 and render same-sex acts legal. They didn't follow the Wolfenden Report. So Scotland historically has kind of lagged behind. But what's interesting is that it doesn't seem as if this is a revolution in attitudes, which has been particularly led by politics. It seems like a kind of quiet revolution of attitudes. I mean, if you go back to the Section 2B, the Section 28 debate, as it was in England, and how bitter and controversial that was, I know a number of people who still bear the scars of how unpleasant Brian Souter's intervention in politics and the outfall of that was for them in terms of homophobia. And yet suddenly now we have a situation where almost 90% of our parliamentarians take it pretty much for granted, in the same logic you said, Michael, and Ivan made reference to. It doesn't seem obvious. Why wouldn't we do this? And I think it's an interesting example of wider social change which we should pause and think about. How did it become commonsensical that the people of the same gender should be entitled to get married? How did that happen? Because it doesn't seem as if there's been a strong, sustained campaign for it across Scottish political life, across UK political life. It seems as if it's a revolution which has happened quietly, maybe even culturally, we might say, in people's homes. So it's in one level you could say it's quite maybe a neoliberal, a market, a kind of cultural maybe revolution in attitudes. And I think we should pause and consider how interesting that is just as a social phenomenon.
Part of me wants to joke and say it's since Mary Whitehouse died, but that wouldn't actually be true. But I think one of the historical reasons that Scotland may have been lagging behind, as you mentioned, was you could talk about the influence of the Church of Scotland. With the lack of a Scottish Parliament at that time, they did often talk about the General Assembly of the Church of Scotland as Scotland's Parliament, if you like, and as the influence of the church has waned, although interestingly I believe there's some kind of split going on over this in the Church of Scotland, and other part of it wants to join up with the Wee Frees who were opposing it. It was over gay clergy, but the equal marriage thing sort of comes as part of this as well, I suppose. But and maybe it could have been the influence of the church in the Church of Scotland that kind of delayed this thing in Scotland a bit more, and now that the Parliament's there and it's more democratic and not with some kinds of religious dogma, maybe that's why things have been speeding up in Scotland a bit more. That's just a possibility, I think.
I mean, I think, like Andrew, being a bit of a geek, I have gone back and read. I didn't watch it live because I was on holiday, but I went back and read it. And I think the interesting things that struck me were, there's a definite thing with Catholicism in Scotland and the strength of Catholicism in Scotland that I think is sort of unhappy with the way that progress is going on gay rights. But then equally, people who had personal experience, as Andrew touched on, were much more inclined to be in favour. There was a very moving speech, I think, from James Dornan about how his brother came out as gay when he was 17 but had to go to London in order to do so, and now lives in Portugal with his partner of 39 years, and they're going to get married, so that's nice. But I think the thing that struck me the most was how this is still only one step towards sort of actually society embracing the diversity that is out there. Because, so you had Ruth Davidson, the leader of the